All right. So to close out our time together this summer, I want to talk to you about the global inequality. And so a lot of what I'll say is probably pretty resonant with early chapters or early weeks that we had, and especially last week when I was talking to you about population, or I'm sorry, political economy and economic change and income and wealth inequalities globally. And so when I'm thinking about global inequality, I think about economic issues as well as population and demographic issues. And so this lecture is going to tie in very well with the population and environment discussion that I gave you in the previous lecture. So we know that the global resource divide is immense. I've given you figures on that and discussed this. We know that the haves and the have-nots globally is enormous. And that we know that part of the reason this global wealth divide emerged is a result of the Industrial Revolution, that modernized, industrialized nations were able to pull far ahead from developing nations. And that therefore industrial nations have much higher incomes and more exports than developing nations. But there's a downside to that, a further undercurrent that's not currently really discussed a lot, which is that modern industrialized nations in the developed world often keep nations in the developing world in an underdeveloped state, that they go in and they're extracting raw resources without making economic investments in developing their own economies. And so our industrial revolution in the modern world or in the developed world has had a significant impact on impinging on their economic development overall. Along with that, I'd like to talk with you about the global demographic divide. And so that's talking about how in some nations in the world, they have really high fertility, high mortality, and low life expectancy. And so there really literally are some nations in the world where a large number of children are expected to die by the time they reach age 5, and that many children die within the first year of life, and that life expectancy is still in the 50s, in some places even in the 40s. So, for example, in many sub-Saharan African nations, because of the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, life expectancy has fallen. Compare that to other nations that have very low fertility and low mortality and very high life expectancy. So, for example, in Japan, they're having fewer births per woman than it would take to replace the man and the woman on average. But they have incredibly high life expectancy. They have the highest on the face of the earth, so it's at like 87. And so we have this real big gap in life chances on your chances of having an extended old age. So this demographic or global economic divide kind of ties into the demographic divide. Our economic issues and population issues interact. And so some people in the world are living in extreme poverty, have very ill health, poor health, low education, and high illiteracy. And so that kind of future faces billions of people on Earth. We have about 7 billion people on Earth, and several billions of them are living in those kind of distressed circumstances. In fact, 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 per day, and that the 40% of the world's population has less than 5% of the global income, and that the richest 20% have 3/4 of global income. If you kind of translate that into daily living, 1.1 billion people do not have adequate access to drinkable water, and that 2.6 billion of them lack basic sanitation. There are some cities in developing nations where there are many millions of people living, where water has to be shipped in by the government, and that there's often water riots about getting access to the water. 2 out of 3 people who lack clean water are surviving on less than $2 per day, and 1 in 3 people in this world are living on less than $1 a day. So that's translating to over 2 billion people. And so I want you to kind of consider that when we're thinking about the haves and the have-nots overall. So different theoretical perspectives for looking at that kind of consider modernization. So there's this modernization theory that talks about the far-reaching process by which nations pass from traditional forms of social organization like agricultural, horticultural, toward forms characteristic of post-industrial revolution societies. They're really high in technology, high in service and retail jobs, and high in kind of international cooperation about creating factory products. Now, some sociologists argue that modernization and development contain an ethnocentric bias, meaning that we look at how the United States and other similar industrial nations did it, and we kind of hold it up as a model of how progress is supposed to look, without really kind of thinking through local cultures and local nations' needs and how they might want to pass or progress through different economic systems. And so basically, modernization can be kind of represented as a form of cultural imperialism, expecting that our form of capitalism is the one that should be used around the world. So when we look at developing nations, those who are living on less than $2 a day, those that don't have access to clean water resources, potable water, we're thinking about colonialism. And colonialism is a maintenance of political, social, economic, and cultural dominance over a people by a foreign power for an extended period of time. And so, in South Asia, we had the British West Indies, we had France controlling several nations. In Africa, we had Belgium and England and Germany and France controlling several of the different colonies in Africa. And in Africa, it wasn't until like the 60s and 70s, especially in the late 70s, that African nations started to overthrow these colonial powers. India is an example, India being under British rule for many, many generations. And so now they argue is that yes, in most respects, colonialism has ended. Foreign nations do not have the right to control the governments of other countries, but they still end up having power because they left behind a legacy of their education or power structures. And so what we now look at is a word called neocolonialism, and that's the continuing dependence of former colonies on foreign countries. So whether it's dependence on aid, dependence on helping with their political structures, that we still see kind of lingering effects of their dependence. Okay, so that leads us to Wallerstein, Immanuel Wallerstein, who's a sociologist and theorist who developed a theory called world systems theory. And what he argues is that the global economic system can be divided between industrialized nations that control wealth and in developing nations that are controlled and exploited. And so his version is kind of like a dependency theory. And it says that industrialized nations continue to exploit developing countries for their own gain. And so the way they envision this is that advanced developed nations, industrialized nations, go to developing nations and extract their raw resources, take them back to the industrialized nations, process and refine them, and sell them for enormous profit. And that the raw resources they're extracting, they don't pay their actual worth to the developing nations. And so the developing nations end up losing their raw resources and often non-renewable resources, and they're not getting economic investments to develop economically in an industrialized kind of way. So that's kind of how the model works. So this means that we're talking about globalization, the worldwide integration of government policies, cultures, social movements, and financial markets through trade and the exchange of ideas. And so we're not just talking about economic systems and political systems. We're actually kind of talking about a third sort of structure we had already mentioned before, which is the growth of multinational corporations. And so a multinational corporation is a commercial organization that's headquartered in one country but does business around the world. It might have businesses, factories, offices in several different places. And so the total revenue of multinational corporations is on a par with the total value of goods and services exchanged in entire nations. And I've mentioned this before, I've discussed this. So here's an example of this. This is from Fortune magazine in the year 2015, as well as gross domestic product data from the World Bank in 2016. And what it's looking at is global 500 companies. So Fortune 500 companies, their annual revenues. And I want to remind you that we're talking about revenues as their profit after they've paid all of their research and development costs, paying their employees, repairing their equipment, buying new equipment, everything. After they've taken care of every cost they have, what is their profit? And then GDP is gross domestic profit for nations, and that means the exchange value of what they create, what they're producing in their market. And so what you can see is that this is in millions of dollars. And so these comparisons are looking at the number one corporation, Walmart, which is earning 476,000 millions of dollars, and as compared to the 26th highest nation in terms of GDP, Norway. And so Walmart is almost has the same level of revenue as Norway has in GDP. And then it compares Royal Dutch Shell, which is the second highest multinational corporation, against the 17th ranked nation of Venezuela. So here you see 459 100,000 millions of dollars for profit for Royal Dutch as compared to 438,000 millions of dollars for Venezuela in GDP. Look down at British Petroleum. British Petroleum is a multinational corporation that was responsible for the Gulf, our Gulf spill, Gulf oil spill a few years ago. And so they make 396,000 millions of dollars in revenue each year. And so that puts them as the sixth highest ranked multinational corporation. And so I'm just trying to show you here that these multinational corporations are producing enormous sums of revenues, working across many different nations, and therefore amassing both kind of political power and financial power. And so they're kind of a separate sort of thing to theoretically model as you're thinking about internet sociology. And so from a modernization perspective, the relationship between multinationals, companies, and developing countries, you could argue that, hey, it's beneficial, right? So a modernization perspective would say that, hey, these multinational corporations, they bring industries and jobs. So they go in and they hire people to extract these raw resources like oil or coal or whatever it is, that they promote rapid development in these developing countries, and that they facilitate the exchange of ideas and technology with them. And so multinational corporations end up helping make the world more interdependent. Nations become interdependent on each other. And so that's one kind of positive way of looking at the rise of multinational corporations at the late 20th and early 21st century. But a dependency perspective would argue that, hey, what multinationals do is exploit local workers to maximize profits. And so that they want cheap foreign labor, and that ends up hurting the industrialized and advanced developed nations because those workers lose jobs, and that the developing country ends up developing laws that are very anti-labor, that they start developing repressive anti-labor laws that even leave their populations at disadvantage. I'll give you an example in a moment. And so basically it looks like investments by multinationals initially contribute to a host nation's wealth, but eventually it increases economic inequality between these developing nations. So an example would be Blackwater Halliburton. So they have a world headquarters in the United States, down in New Orleans, but they have a presence throughout the world. And in one place that they're at is in Papua New Guinea. And what they're doing is extracting minerals from the soil. And so they need to use a lot of raw resources in terms of water, a lot of water, to clean the product and to separate the product that's valuable to them from the sludge and the dredge from the mining. And so they've been caught routinely for dumping the pollution directly into the water supply, and that this is a very low developed society in which a lot of peasant society, a large percentage of the population, lives on those waterways, and they're experiencing highly polluted waters. Their fishing is dying, their health is really impacted, and cancer rates have been rising. And so the people tried to revolt against it and demand better treatment from Blackwater, especially since very few Papua New Guineans were hired by Blackwater. And Blackwater got in trouble internationally for this kind of behavior. But what ended up happening is that Blackwater got the Papua New Guinea government to use their own military forces to put down a rebellion by the people. So that's an example, like a developing country maybe putting their own workers' interests in second place in order to court or to keep these multinationals. Sorry, I have a typo in multinational in that first sentence. So when we think about stratification around the world, in at least 22 nations, the most affluent 10% of the population receives at least 40% of all the income, and that what we know is that women in developing countries face really significant obstacles. They're often really prohibited from having equality in education, equality in employment. In some nations, women still are prohibited from voting, and so women are not having the same access to employment opportunities and income security. And so here's some examples. This is again from years 2015 from World Bank data, and it's looking at the lowest 20%, how much share of income they have as compared to the highest 20% of the population. And so you can see in the U.S. is kind of below India there, low down in the graph, and so it shows you that the lowest 20% of earners in the United States only earned 4.7% of all the income, whereas the top 20% earn 46% of all income in the nation. For India, we kind of look like India. 8.5% of the lowest 20% earn, the 8.5% of the income, and 43% of the top 20%, or 20%, the top 20% earn 43% of all the income. So South Africa is extremely unequal in income, right? So here you see the lowest 20% earns only 2.5% of all the income in South Africa, and the top 20% have 70%. And so it's really kind of interesting to think about inequality differences around the world. Okay, so you can see even Canada has kind of significant inequalities. And you'll remember that I told you that wealth inequality is even higher. And so this is from 2014 data, and it's looking at the top 10% and the top 1%. And so again, the United States is further along in the graph, and it's showing you that the top 1%, as I've told you before, earns about 25% of all the wealth, and that the top 10% owns almost 80% of all the wealth, right? In fact, it looks like 80%. If you see, it looks, for the world, we look pretty similar to the world statistics, right? And so in the world, the top 1% has over 45% of all of the wealth, and the top 10% has over 90% of all the wealth. And so we're looking at extraordinary inequality in terms of wealth concentration. And you'll remember that I told you that if you have assets of at least $4,000, that puts you in the top half of the world's population in terms of well-being. And so how do we think about all this? Well, it's interesting to kind of think about human rights, right? And so it took us from the mid-20th century to start articulating universal human rights. And so we started to create a human rights document where we talked about whether there's universal moral rights that all people possess by virtue of being human, and that the elaboration of human rights appears in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the chair of the committee was our Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman who was First Lady to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so she is known as the mother of human rights. And so that's, I think, a very important and interesting thing. You can get on the internet. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is pretty simple. They don't have that many provisions. It's as easy to read as our Constitution, so I encourage you to do it. Now, over the course of time, it's changed considerably since the 1940s. And in fact, in 1990s, we started to think about how we might incorporate things like ethnic cleansing into our world vocabulary about human rights. That we know that we were using ethnic cleansing as a euphemism for forcible expulsion of people from lands that they were used to living in, or mass murder and genocide. And so in the 1990s, in Eastern Europe, we were seeing mass genocide and mass killings. And so that's when we started looking at ethnic cleansing and genocide as an ongoing world issue and not just something that the Nazis engaged in World War II. And that also during this time period, we began to articulate rape as a weapon of war and a form of ethnic cleansing, that rape was being routinely used in ethnic conflict and genocidal conflict to try and force populations to have babies from the dominant group, or else as a way of entirely demoralizing a group based on their race or ethnic or religious identity. Now, in more modern times, we're seeing transnational crime around human trafficking is an ongoing concern, and that now we're trying to develop a universal human rights vocabulary about sex trafficking and labor trafficking of humans. Okay, so we're also seeing, to kind of close this out, that the U.S. war on terrorism is raising kind of additional concerns about human rights and civil liberties. How are we supposed to cooperate with others around the world about asserting human rights and civil liberties? How are we supposed to fight the war on terror? Is reducing the war on terror dependent on helping nations when they're failed nation states like Syria? Or is it helping them develop and strengthen their economies and their access to education? Like, how are we supposed to have long-term investment in human rights and reduce the war on terror? And then also we have to think about how maybe our own standards of human rights are not felt the same way by other cultures, how we can have respect. So for example, France is an example. France really believes in we use them for thinking about maybe having a revolution, but then they used our ideas to develop their ideas about what's a constitutional democracy. And so we have a really kind of strong vision about what independence is and liberty, right? Other cultures don't necessarily feel as strongly about independence and liberty, and that they want different family members to be more submissive. And so we're working on how to kind of have a dialogue about what are human rights overall. And some people argue that the way that the UN and sometimes the way the US approaches human rights is a form of cultural imperialism, that there's a real dialogue about this. And that generally, though, when we look at human rights, we see that it's not necessarily a government that's going to be a forerunner of human rights. That what you're going to see that human rights usually arise out of social movements, protests, people struggling for their human rights. And so I would encourage you again, to close this out, I would just encourage you to take a look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And that's all. You take care. Bye-bye.